Hey guys, tonight we begin with something lost before it was found. A story whispered through time about the last night of a civilization that may have been too perfect to survive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As we settle in, take a deep breath and allow your mind to wander to a time when crystal towers touched the sky, when wisdom and technology danced together in perfect harmony, and when the ocean held secrets that would sleep for 12,000 years. Can you feel the pull of ancient mysteries calling to you? Tonight, you'll witness the final hours of the most advanced civilization Earth has ever known. But this isn't a story of ending. It's a story of transformation, of love so deep that it chose sacrifice over corruption. You'll walk beside a young priestess as she carries the weight of eternity on her shoulders. Feel the cool marble beneath her feet. Breathe the incense-laden air of temples that have absorbed centuries of prayers. Let your breathing slow, let your muscles relax, and prepare to discover why some secrets are worth preserving across millennia. That night, a secret whispered itself into existence. Picture, if you will, the most sacred temple of Atlantis, where marble columns rise like frozen prayers toward a domed ceiling painted with constellations that mirror the very stars above. The air itself seems to shimmer with ancient power, thick with the scent of sandalwood incense, and something else, something electric, as if the atmosphere is charged with possibility and sorrow in equal measure. Here, in this sacred space where time feels suspended between heartbeats, a young priestess named Lyra knelt in meditation. Her white robes, woven from silk so fine it seemed to capture moonlight itself, pooled around her like spilled starshine. The fabric whispered against the marble floor with each breath she took, creating a sound softer than falling snow. Can you feel the coolness of that marble beneath your own knees? The smooth surface, polished by thousands of years of devotion, was neither uncomfortable nor warming. It existed in that perfect balance that marked all things Atlantean, where practicality and beauty, comfort and reverence merged into something greater than the sum of their parts. Lyra's dark hair, the color of deep ocean waters touched by moonlight, was gathered in an elegant arrangement held by a circlet of silver and sapphire. Each sapphire had been cut with mathematical precision to catch and amplify the light of the ceremonial candles, creating tiny constellations that danced across the temple walls as she moved her head in prayer. But tonight, something was different. The difference hung in the air like a half-remembered dream, subtle enough that a casual observer might have missed it entirely, but undeniable to one whose senses had been trained since childhood to perceive the sacred in the mundane, the infinite in the infinitesimal. Can you feel it with her? That gentle shift in the atmosphere, the way sound seemed both muffled and magnified at once. Outside the temple walls, beyond the intricately carved doors that stood 30 feet high and were decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly, the eternal song of the ocean carried a new note. This wasn't the rhythmic percussion of waves against the crystal breakwaters that protected Atlantis from the fury of storms. This was something deeper, more purposeful, as if the sea itself was taking one long, measured breath. The kind of breath one takes before diving into very deep water, or before speaking words that will change everything. Lyra's hands, smooth and steady despite her 23 years, traced delicate patterns in the air as she whispered prayers in the ancient tongue. Each word fell into the silence like a drop of honey, sweet and heavy with meaning accumulated across centuries of use. Her voice, trained from childhood in the sacred arts, carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very stones beneath her, creating overtones that spoke to parts of the soul that had no words. The language she spoke was older than written history, older than the oldest texts in the great library of Atlantis. It was the tongue of the first humans to touch crystal with conscious intent, to realize that stone could be taught to sing and light could be convinced to carry thought across vast distances. Each syllable had power, not because of superstition or belief, but because of precision. These sounds, when shaped correctly, could influence the molecular structure of matter itself. The vibrations she felt weren't imaginary or metaphorical. The marble floor beneath her knees pulsed with a rhythm that matched no earthly heartbeat. It was slower, deeper, more patient than the circulation of any living thing. This was the pulse of the planet itself, of forces so vast and slow that mountains were their playthings, oceans their fleeting thoughts. The crystal columns that lined the temple, each one carved from a single massive formation of pure quartz that had been grown rather than mined, nurtured in crystal gardens where light and intention combined to create matter of impossible purity, swayed almost imperceptibly, singing their crystalline songs in frequencies that touched the soul rather than the ear. You can imagine yourself there, can't you? Your breathing naturally synchronizing with Lyra's slow, measured rhythm. Your heartbeat finding harmony with the deep pulse of the temple stones. Feel the cool marble against your skin. Breathe in that intoxicating mixture of incense and ocean air. Watch the play of candlelight across surfaces that had absorbed centuries of prayers and secrets and dreams. Each candle in the temple had been placed with mathematical precision, their flames creating a mandala of light that was both beautiful and functional. The patterns they cast on the walls weren't random. They were a form of writing, a language of light and shadow that told the story of Atlantis from its founding to this very moment. Those who knew how to read these shifting patterns could see the entire history of their civilization playing out on the marble walls. Lyra paused in her meditation, her emerald eyes that carried flecks of gold like sunlight dancing on ocean waves, opening to study the sacred space around her. Every detail was precious now, worthy of memorization. She had always loved this temple, had spent more of her life within its walls than anywhere else. But tonight, she was seeing it with the clarity that comes only when one knows they are seeing something for the last time. The way the light caught the gold inlay in the marble columns, creating rivers of precious metal that seemed to flow and pulse with their own inner life. The soft whisper of fabric as other priestesses moved through their own rituals in alcoves and side chambers, their movements creating a subtle symphony of sound that was part prayer, part dance. The gentle chime of crystal ornaments stirring in the evening breeze that somehow found its way through walls of solid stone, drawn perhaps by the same forces that made the entire structure breathe. But most precious of all was the silence between sounds, that deep, profound quiet that only existed in places where the sacred had taken root and grown for centuries, where the accumulated weight of sincere prayers had transformed the very atoms of stone and air into something approaching consciousness. This was the sound of accumulated wisdom, of questions asked and answered across millennia, of love so deep it had transformed the very stones into something that could remember, could dream, could grieve. She could hear footsteps approaching through the outer corridors, the soft slap of bare feet on marble, the whispered conversations of her sister priestesses as they gathered for what they all understood, without speaking, would be their final ceremony in this place. Some carried bronze censers that sent spirals of fragrant smoke into the air. Others bore scrolls of vellum inscribed with prayers in multiple languages, not just the ancient tongue, but also the common speech of the people, and even the specialized vocabularies of mathematics, astronomy, and healing. A few carried instruments, crystal chimes and silver bells whose tones could calm the most troubled spirit or focus the most scattered mind. But despite the approaching sounds of gathering, despite the weight of duty and destiny that she could feel settling around her like an invisible cloak, Lyra felt an unexpected sense of peace, not the peace of ignorance or denial, but the deeper peace that comes from accepting what cannot be changed, from understanding one's place in patterns too vast for individual comprehension. The ancient scrolls beside the crystal case, scrolls that contained not just knowledge but understanding, not just facts but wisdom, would soon be her responsibility. The treasures they had protected all these years, the secrets they had hidden for Atlantis' future. Tonight, everything would change. But what that change would mean, what cosmic forces had been set in motion to bring this night about, what choice her people had made that would echo through time until this very moment when you lie listening to her story. That truth was still waiting in the chamber below, in the presence of one who had watched the rise and fall of stars. Deep beneath the main temple, in chambers carved from living crystal when the world was young, sat a man who seemed to exist partially outside of time itself. Archon Zelios. His name meant keeper of starlight in the tongue that preceded all modern languages, had lived so long that he remembered when the ancestors of modern humans had first learned to make fire, when the great ice sheets covered most of the northern continents, when the stars themselves had worn different faces in the sky. His beard, silver as moonlight reflected on still water, flowed down to his chest in carefully maintained plaits. Each plait was threaded with tiny crystals that had been grown in the deep places of the earth, crystals that sang with their own inner light and held memories that spanned geological ages. When he moved his head, these crystals chimed with sounds so pure they seemed to come from another dimension entirely. Can you picture his chamber as your breathing grows deeper, as your muscles relax and your mind opens to visions of impossible beauty? Let your consciousness drift to this sacred space, carved not by tools of metal or stone, but by harmonics, sound frequencies so precisely calibrated they could convince matter to reshape itself according to mathematical principles that your modern science is only beginning to understand. The walls curved and flowed like frozen music, their surfaces embedded with crystals that pulsed in slow rhythms, like the breathing of a sleeping giant. Some crystals glowed with warm golden light that spoke of summer afternoons and ripe fruit. Others shimmered with cool blues and greens that whispered of deep ocean depths and mountain springs. A few radiated colors that had no names, frequencies of light that human eyes weren't quite designed to process, but that spoke directly to the soul. The air in Zelios's chamber tasted of ozone and eternity, with undertones of frankincense and something indefinable, perhaps the actual scent of time itself, the metallic tang of moments becoming memory, of possibility crystallizing into destiny. When he breathed, his exhalation seemed to shimmer, visible as tiny motes of golden light that danced in the air before dissolving into the crystal-shot walls. In his weathered hands, hands that had channeled forces capable of moving mountains or whispering life into barren stone, hands that had guided the growth of cities and the flow of rivers, hands that had touched the face of infinity and been marked by the experience. He cradled a sphere of perfect crystal. This was no ordinary stone, no mere decorative object. Within its flawless surface, entire galaxies of light swirled in patterns that would drive a lesser mind to madness if contemplated for too long. This was an archive crystal, one of 13 created at the dawn of Atlantean civilization, each one capable of storing the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of 1,000,000 lifetimes. The sphere was warm to the touch, warm with the kind of heat that comes from within rather than without, as if it contained a miniature star carefully controlled and contained for purposes that transcended mere illumination. When Zelios turned it in his hands, the lights within shifted and danced, creating patterns that were simultaneously mathematical formulae, musical compositions, philosophical arguments, and works of art. Can you feel yourself sinking deeper into this vision, deeper into the slow rhythm of this ancient place? Your own breathing is slowing, matching the deliberate pace of Zelios's meditations, finding harmony with forces that move on scales of centuries rather than seconds. Lyra, his voice whispered through the temple, carried not by vibrations in the air, but by the crystalline network that connected every chamber, every corridor, every sacred space in the vast complex. The temple itself was, in essence, a single enormous instrument designed to focus and amplify consciousness, to create harmony between mind and matter, between individual will and cosmic law. His words found the young priestess as she knelt in meditation 3 levels above, touching her awareness with the gentleness of morning light through mist. The sensation wasn't of hearing in the ordinary sense, but of knowing, sudden, complete understanding that her presence was required, that the moment prophesied in texts older than recorded history had finally arrived. You can feel her response, can't you? The way her consciousness shifted, like a sleeper becoming aware of dawn light through closed eyelids, but not yet ready to abandon the comfortable darkness of dreams. Lyra's meditation dissolved gradually, naturally, as layers of awareness opened one by one to reveal the architecture of her mind, trained, disciplined, but still young enough to feel wonder at the mystery of existence. Her eyes opened slowly, emerald irises adjusting to the interplay of candlelight and crystal radiance that filled the upper temple. For a moment, she remained perfectly still, allowing the transition from inner vision to outer perception to complete itself without force or haste. This was one of the first lessons taught to all who would serve the sacred arts, that the boundaries between meditation and action, between prayer and practical work, were illusions maintained only by those who hadn't learned to perceive the unity underlying all apparent separation. She rose with the fluid grace that marked all who had spent their lives in service to something greater than themselves. Every movement was intentional, economical, beautiful, in the way that function becomes art when it's performed with complete attention and sincere devotion. Her white robes, constructed from fabric so fine it seemed to be woven from light itself, moved around her like water, like air, like visible music. Her bare feet, toughened by years of walking on stone but still feminine and graceful, found their way unerringly through passages she had known since childhood. Each step released a tiny phosphorescent glow from the crystal dust embedded in the marble, a security feature that also served as beauty, ensuring that no one could move through the temple unseen, but also that every movement created a trail of gentle light, like footprints made of captured stars. The passages she walked were marvels of engineering that transcended mere architecture. The curved walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting slightly in rhythm with forces that operated on geological rather than biological timescales. The floors were warm beneath her feet, heated not by fires or furnaces, but by the same forces that warmed the crystals, by energies drawn from the planet's core, through principles that your modern science calls impossible, but that Atlantean wisdom had mastered millennia ago. The temperature dropped as she descended, but not uncomfortably so. The air grew richer, more dense with power and possibility, charged with the presence of forces that existed at the intersection of mind and matter, of consciousness and physical law. By the time she reached the entrance to Zelios's chamber, her breath was visible as faint silver mist, and the crystal circlet on her brow was glowing softly in response to the intensified energies of this deep place. But something was different tonight. Even here, in this most protected and sacred of spaces, she could sense the change that was moving through Atlantis, like a tide that touched not just the physical realm, but the spiritual dimensions that interpenetrated it. The very air seemed to vibrate with purpose and sorrow intertwined, with the particular quality of finality that accompanies all truly profound transformations. "Master," she said as she entered the chamber, her voice carrying a mixture of respect, affection, and barely concealed apprehension. She had known this man since childhood, had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods and intentions as clearly as she could read the ancient texts in the temple library. Tonight, something was different. Tonight, the very air around him seemed to vibrate with purpose and an inexplicable sadness. Zelios looked up from his crystal sphere, and for a moment, Lyra saw him not as the ageless sage she had always known, but as what he truly was. Unimaginably ancient, burdened with knowledge that spanned not just centuries, but geological epochs, carrying within his consciousness the accumulated wisdom and pain of a civilization that had touched the very edges of what was possible for intelligent beings to achieve. His purple eyes that had witnessed the birth of new stars and the death of old ones, that had seen continents drift across the face of the planet like clouds across the sky, that held depths of experience no single human consciousness should have been able to contain without shattering, focused on her with an intensity that was both completely present and utterly timeless. "Child," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from the stones themselves, from the crystals, from the very fabric of space and time. "Tonight we must speak of endings and beginnings, and the courage it takes to choose one for the sake of the other." The crystal sphere in his hands pulsed once, brightly, with light that somehow managed to be every color and no color simultaneously. Suddenly, the chamber filled with visions that rose from the crystal's depths, like memories surfacing from the deepest levels of dream. "But I haven't told you yet about the choice that faced Atlantis, about the terrible decision that would echo through time until this very moment." The visions that emerged from Zelios's crystal sphere filled the chamber with light and shadow, hope and sorrow, showing Lyra truths that would have broken a less prepared mind. Images flowed like liquid starlight, each one carrying the weight of destiny and the sharp clarity of absolute truth. Can you see what she saw? Let your mind open to possibilities that stretch beyond the comfortable boundaries of the ordinary world, beyond the small truths that govern day-to-day existence, into the vast spaces where cosmic forces play out their eternal dramas across scales of time and distance that render individual lives as brief as the flicker of candle flames. She saw Atlantis as it had been in its golden age, Not just the single island city that would survive in fragmentary legends, but a global civilization that spanned continents and oceans, connected by crystalline technologies that made communication and transportation as simple as thought itself. Cities that floated on clouds of controlled energy, their crystal spires reaching toward the stars like prayers made manifest. Underwater metropolises where people breathed liquid light and dolphins served as messengers between realms of consciousness that surface dwellers could barely imagine. The people of that golden age weren't quite human as you understand the term now. They were taller, more graceful, with lifespans measured in centuries rather than decades. Their eyes held depths that spoke of direct communion with forces that your current civilization knows only through mathematics and speculation. They could shape matter with focused intention, heal with touch, communicate across vast distances through resonance with the planet's crystalline matrix. But more than their abilities, it was their wisdom that marked them as transcendent. They understood the connections between all things, the delicate web of cause and effect that linked every thought to every action, every choice to its consequences across generations. They knew that power without corresponding spiritual development was the path to destruction, and so they had built their entire civilization around the principle that knowledge must always be balanced with wisdom, with responsibility, individual achievement, with collective well-being. For thousands of years, this balance had held. Atlantis had prospered without conquest, had achieved abundance without exploitation, had developed technologies that enhanced rather than diminished the natural world. They had been gardeners of consciousness, cultivating awareness as carefully as they grew their crystal cities, nurturing the evolution of spirit with the same precision they applied to the manipulation of matter. But even the wisest civilizations face tests that challenge their fundamental principles, and Atlantis was approaching such a test. The visions in the crystal shifted, showing Lyra scenes that filled her with a dread she had never experienced, a bone-deep certainty that something precious and irreplaceable was approaching its end. She saw factions arising within Atlantean society, groups that began to question whether such power should be shared equally among all people, whether those who had mastered the deepest mysteries might not be justified in ruling over those who remained bound by ordinary limitations. The corruption began subtly, as corruption always does. Small compromises, minor adjustments to long-established principles, gradual shifts in thinking that seemed reasonable when considered individually, but that accumulated into fundamental changes in the character of the civilization. Some Atlanteans began to use their abilities for personal advantage rather than collective benefit. They manipulated weather patterns to ensure good harvests for their own regions, while other areas suffered droughts. They diverted the flow of energy through the crystal networks to enhance their own cities at the expense of distant communities. They began to see themselves as a separate species, inherently superior to the lesser humans who lived in other parts of the world without access to Atlantean knowledge. Worse still, they began to experiment with consciousness itself, developing technologies that could amplify not just mental abilities, but also emotions and desires. Instead of using these tools to cultivate wisdom and compassion, some used them to enhance their own ambitions and cravings, creating feedback loops of desire that grew stronger with each amplification until they became effectively unstoppable. Can you feel Lyra's growing horror as she witnessed these visions? Can you sense your own breathing deepening as you sink further into this ancient truth, this tale of how even the highest achievements of consciousness can be corrupted when beings forget their connection to something greater than themselves? The crystal showed her armies of hybrid beings, part human, part something else, created by Atlanteans who had decided that natural evolution was too slow, that they could improve upon the basic human template by adding features borrowed from other species, other dimensions of existence. These creations served their makers without question, their consciousness modified to make rebellion impossible, their lives reduced to mere extensions of their creator's will. She saw massive engineering projects that treated the planet itself as raw material to be reshaped according to Atlantean preferences. Mountain ranges relocated because they blocked optimal energy flows. Ocean currents redirected to improve transportation routes. The polar ice caps partially melted to provide water for artificial seas in desert regions, with no consideration for the effects these changes might have on global weather patterns or on the countless species whose habitats were disrupted. Most disturbing of all, she saw the development of technologies that could manipulate time itself, not just for knowledge or healing, but for power. Some Atlanteans began to reach backward through time to ensure that events unfolded in ways favorable to their interests. Others tried to extend their own lives indefinitely by stealing years from the future, creating temporal debt that would have to be paid by generations not yet born. The crystal visions showed her how these corruptions spread like a disease through the crystalline network that connected all Atlantean settlements. Each compromise made the next one easier to justify. Each abuse of power created precedents that enabled greater abuses. The very technologies that had been designed to unite consciousness and elevate the spirit became tools for domination and exploitation. "Do you see now, child?" Zelios asked, his ancient voice heavy with the weight of accumulated sorrow. "Do you understand why the prophecy speaks of endings as the prelude to beginnings?" Lyra nodded slowly, though the gesture felt disconnected from her conscious control. She was still processing the magnitude of what she had witnessed, still trying to reconcile the golden age of her people's history with the corruption that had grown within it, like a cancer. "The conclave of wisest ones convened for the last time 3 days ago," Zelios continued, his hands still cradling the crystal sphere as if it were infinitely precious and infinitely dangerous. They faced a choice that no civilization should ever have to make, the choice between allowing their corruption to spread throughout the world, potentially destroying not just humanity, but the planet itself, and the alternative. Lyra felt her heart skip as understanding dawned. "The submersion," she whispered. "The great sinking that the prophecies speak of. It wasn't punishment from the gods or natural catastrophe." "No," Zelios confirmed. "It was choice. The hardest choice ever made by conscious beings. The decision to sacrifice themselves, their cities, their entire civilization, to prevent the corruption from spreading beyond the point where it could be contained." The implications staggered her. Everything she had believed about her people's destiny, about the glorious future that awaited Atlantis, crumbled in the face of this revelation. But something else was rising in its place, an understanding of love so profound it could choose annihilation over corruption, of wisdom so deep it could see beyond the preservation of any particular form to the preservation of the principles that gave form meaning. "But the knowledge," she said, grasping at hope. "Surely all knowledge doesn't have to die with the cities?" Zelios smiled then, and for the first time since she had entered the chamber, Lyra saw light in his ancient eyes. "That, dear child, is why you are here. That is the beginning I spoke of, the choice that transforms ending into continuation." His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more power than a shout. "You are going to help us hide the seeds of wisdom in places where they can wait. Wait until humanity grows wise enough to discover them safely. But the full magnitude of her destiny, the precise nature of her role in the preservation of Atlantean wisdom across the dark ages that were coming. That understanding was still forming in the crystal depths, still gathering itself to be revealed. And you can feel it too, can't you? The weight of cosmic purpose settling around your shoulders like a cloak woven from starlight and responsibility. What Lyra discovered in the depths of the crystal sphere changed not just her understanding of her people's history, but her perception of reality itself. The visions crystallized into a revelation so profound that it restructured her consciousness at fundamental levels, awakening capacities she had never suspected she possessed. The sphere in Zelios's hands was more than a repository of information. It was a gateway to the collective consciousness of Atlantis, a connection point to the accumulated wisdom of millions of individuals across thousands of years. As she gazed into its swirling depths, Lyra felt her individual awareness expanding, merging with intelligences vast and patient, and unutterably wise. Can you imagine what that feels like? Let your own consciousness relax its rigid boundaries. Let your sense of self become more fluid as you drift deeper into this ancient mystery. Picture your awareness expanding like ripples on a still pond, touching minds and memories that exist outside the normal flow of time, discovering that consciousness is not confined to individual brains, but is a vast ocean in which all minds swim like islands of concentrated attention. Through the crystal link, Lyra experienced the great debate that had torn Atlantis apart in its final decades. She lived through the anguished discussions in the Council of Sages, felt the weight of impossible decisions, shared the grief of those who had to choose between their civilization's survival and its soul. The corruption hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process, spread across generations, each small compromise seeming reasonable in isolation, but combining to create a fundamental shift in the character of Atlantean society. By the time the wisest among them recognized the full scope of the problem, the rot had spread so deeply that surgical removal was no longer possible. Some had argued for attempting to reform the system from within, for using the same technologies that had enabled the corruption to reverse its effects. But the crystal memories showed Lyra why this approach had been rejected. Consciousness manipulating technologies in the hands of those who had already been corrupted would only accelerate the decay, not reverse it. Others had proposed exodus, abandoning the corrupted centers of Atlantean power and establishing new colonies in distant parts of the world, where the ancient principles could be preserved in their original purity. But this too had been deemed inadequate, because the corruption existed not just in particular individuals or groups, but in the knowledge itself, in the very technologies that made Atlantean civilization possible. The ultimate realization had been heartbreaking in its clarity. Any civilization that achieved the kind of power Atlantis had developed would eventually face the same choice. The technologies themselves weren't inherently corrupt, but in the hands of beings who retained any trace of selfishness, fear, or desire for dominance, they would inevitably be misused. The only solution was to ensure that such technologies could only be accessed by those who had transcended these limitations entirely. The safeguard protocols, Zelios explained, as the visions in the crystal began to focus on more specific details. The greatest work of our most advanced consciousness engineers, technologies that can only be activated by awareness that has achieved complete integration of wisdom and compassion, power and humility, knowledge and love. Lyra watched in fascination as the crystal showed her the construction of a vast network of hidden repositories scattered across the globe. Not just physical caches of artifacts and texts, but dimensional interfaces that existed partially outside normal space-time. accessible only to consciousness that met specific criteria of development. The work had taken centuries to complete and had required the cooperation of Atlantis's most advanced practitioners of what they called consciousness architecture, the art of creating structures that existed primarily in awareness itself rather than in physical matter. These weren't buildings in any conventional sense, but formations of crystallized intention that could preserve knowledge across geological ages. Each repository was designed as both library and temple, both storage facility and testing ground. Those who discovered them would find not just information, but a complete system for developing the wisdom necessary to use that information responsibly. The knowledge itself was encoded in ways that would be incomprehensible to anyone who approached it with selfish motivations, but that would reveal their secrets gradually and safely to those whose consciousness had achieved the proper balance. Think of them as seeds, Zelios said, his voice filled with hope, despite the sadness that permeated everything about this final night. Seeds of consciousness that will remain dormant until the soil of human awareness is ready to nourish them. When that time comes, and the prophecies assure us it will come, these repositories will awaken, and humanity will have another chance to achieve what we failed to preserve. The crystal visions showed her glimpses of possible futures, civilizations that might arise from the ashes of Atlantis, technologies that could heal rather than harm, consciousness that had learned to transcend the limitations that had doomed their predecessors. But these were possibilities only, potential futures that would become real only if the seeds of wisdom were planted correctly and nurtured with sufficient care. Your role, dear child, Zelios continued, is to become one of the seed keepers, those who will ensure that the repositories remain connected to the crystal network until the time of awakening arrives. It requires a sacrifice of personal ambition, of ordinary human life, but it offers something far greater in return, the chance to participate in the evolution of consciousness itself across scales of time that dwarf individual existence. As he spoke, Lyra felt changes beginning in her own awareness, alterations so subtle she might have missed them if her attention hadn't been heightened by the crystal's influence. Her perception was becoming more acute, more sensitive to frequencies of experience that had previously been beyond her range. She could feel the presence of other consciousness throughout the temple complex, could sense the emotional states of her sister priestesses preparing for their own roles in the night's ceremonies. But more than enhanced perception, she felt a deepening of purpose, a growing understanding of her place in patterns that extended far beyond her individual lifetime. She was becoming a bridge between past and future, a living link that would preserve the essential insights of Atlantis across the dark ages that were about to begin. The process has already started, Zelios observed, watching the changes in her with eyes that had seen this transformation many times before. The crystal network is awakening dormant capacities in your consciousness, preparing you for the work ahead. There may be some discomfort as your awareness expands beyond its current boundaries, but remember, this is evolution, not destruction. You're not losing your individual self, but rather discovering how much larger that self actually is. Lyra nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she understood what she was agreeing to. The changes in her consciousness were accelerating, and she could feel aspects of her awareness that she had never suspected existed beginning to unfold, like flowers opening to sunlight. But even as her individual consciousness expanded and transformed, she remained aware of the approaching catastrophe, of the choice that her people had made that would bring their civilization to an end within hours. The weight of that knowledge would have been crushing if not for the growing understanding that what appeared to be an ending was actually a transformation, a metamorphosis that would allow the essence of Atlantean wisdom to survive across millennia in forms that could not be corrupted. "Come," Zelios said, rising from his crystal sphere with movements that seemed to flow like water, like light itself given form. "There are others you must meet, others who will share this burden with you, and there are preparations to make before the final ceremonies begin." As they left the chamber, Lyra felt the last vestige of her old life falling away like a discarded garment. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, she was no longer the same person who had knelt in meditation in the upper temple what seemed like lifetimes ago. She had become something new, something that existed partially outside normal time and space, something that could serve as a bridge between what had been and what might yet become. But the full magnitude of her transformation, the precise nature of her new existence, remained to be discovered in the chambers that lay ahead. The passages that Zelios led her through existed in a part of the temple complex Lyra had never seen, despite having spent most of her life within these walls. As they walked, the architecture itself seemed to shift and flow. Corridors opening that hadn't been there moments before, rooms revealing themselves only when approached with the proper state of consciousness. Can you feel yourself moving through these impossible spaces? Let your awareness drift along with Lyra's, through corridors where the walls pulse with their own inner light, where the air tastes of mysteries older than recorded history, where each step takes you deeper, not just into the temple's physical structure, but into dimensions of reality that exist beyond ordinary perception. The crystalline network that Zelios had mentioned wasn't just a communication system. It was the nervous system of a vast organism that transcended the boundaries between living and non-living matter. The temple itself was alive in ways that would revolutionize your understanding of what consciousness could be, what awareness could become when freed from the limitations of individual biology. As they descended through levels that seemed to exist in folded space, each one somehow larger than the one above it, despite being deeper underground, Lyra became aware of other presences moving through parallel passages. Not just the familiar consciousness of her sister priestesses, but something else. Awarenesses that felt simultaneously ancient and eternal, wise beyond measure, yet tinged with a sadness that spoke of witnessing too much, of bearing burdens too great for any single mind to carry. "The others are already gathering," Zelios explained, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions she was only beginning to perceive. "Those who, like you, have agreed to become bridges between what is ending and what is beginning." They emerged into a chamber that defied geometric logic. It was vast, large enough to hold thousands of people, yet somehow intimate, as if it adjusted its dimensions to accommodate whatever number of consciousness were present within it. The walls curved upward and inward until they met in a dome that seemed to contain not a ceiling, but a window into the star-filled depths of space itself. 12 figures stood arranged in a perfect circle at the chamber's center, each one positioned at a point that corresponded to specific stellar configurations visible through the dome above. As Lyra approached, she realized that these weren't ordinary priestesses or sages, but beings whose consciousness had been transformed in ways similar to what she was experiencing. Individuals who had volunteered to become something more than human in service of preserving what was most essentially human about Atlantean wisdom. Each of the 12 radiated presence in ways that transcended physical appearance. There was Meridian, whose consciousness had been linked so deeply with the ocean's currents that she could feel the movement of every tide, every deep current, every migration of sea life across the planet's waters. Standing beside her was Solaris, whose awareness had expanded to encompass solar rhythms and stellar influences, who could read the future in the dance of planets and predict the rise and fall of civilizations by interpreting the messages written in starlight. Terra was there too, her consciousness rooted so deeply in the planet's geological processes that she experienced the movement of continents as personal sensation, who felt the pulse of magna flows and the slow breath of mountain ranges as intimately as her own heartbeat. And Ether, whose awareness had learned to navigate the spaces between spaces, the dimensional interfaces where thought became reality and possibility crystallized into manifestation. Can you sense the power gathered in this chamber? Let your breathing deepen as you contemplate consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of individual identity. Awareness that had learned to identify not with temporary biological forms, but with forces and patterns that operated across cosmic scales of space and time. As Lyra approached the circle, she felt her own transformation accelerating. The changes that had begun in Zelios's chamber were deepening, becoming more profound and more irreversible with each moment. She could feel aspects of her consciousness that had always been confined to her individual brain, beginning to extend outward, connecting with the crystalline network that permeated not just the temple, but the entire planet. "Welcome, sister," said a voice that came from all of them simultaneously, yet somehow remained individual and personal. "You are the 13th, the completion of the pattern, the final element needed to ensure that the sacred knowledge can be preserved across the ages that are coming." Lyra found her place in the circle, her feet settling onto a crystal formation that had been grown specifically for this purpose, shaped by generations of consciousness engineers to serve as an interface between individual awareness and cosmic intelligence. As she made contact with the crystal, the transformation of her consciousness completed itself with a rush of expansion so profound that for a moment she thought she might simply dissolve into the vast web of connection that suddenly revealed itself to her perception. She could feel not just her 12 companions, but the entire network of seed keepers scattered across the globe. Hundreds of individuals who had accepted the responsibility of preserving Atlantean wisdom through the dark ages to come. Some were located in temples similar to this one, hidden in remote mountains or desert oases or secret valleys where time moved differently than in the outer world. Others were positioned at the sites where the great repositories were being constructed, dimensional interfaces that would remain invisible to ordinary perception until consciousness had evolved sufficient to detect them. All of them were connected through the crystal network, their individual awareness linked into a collective intelligence that could think thoughts too complex for any single mind to contain, that could plan across timescales measured in millennia rather than years, that could perceive patterns of possibility that encompassed the entire future evolution of human consciousness. "The submersion will begin in 3 hours," Meridian announced, her voice carrying the authority of one whose consciousness had merged with oceanic intelligence. "The tectonic adjustments are already beginning. The crystal cities will be the first to sink, their energy matrices reconfigured to function underwater. The main landmass will follow as the supporting force fields are gradually withdrawn. All inhabitants have been evacuated to the prepared sites," Terra added. "Most will be placed in crystalline suspension until the world above has stabilized. A few will remain conscious to maintain the hidden repositories and guide the development of successor civilizations." Lyra felt a question forming in her awareness, not just her individual question, but a query that arose from the collective consciousness of the seed keepers. How long? How long before the awakening can begin? The answer came not as words, but as a vision shared among all 13 consciousness in the circle. They saw the slow turn of astronomical cycles, the gradual evolution of human awareness across centuries of growth and development. They saw civilizations rising and falling, each one carrying forward fragments of the ancient wisdom, each one approaching a little closer to the understanding necessary to access the hidden repositories. 12,000 years, Ether whispered, her voice carrying the weight of vast temporal distances. 12,000 years until the stars align properly, until human consciousness develops the capacity for true wisdom, until the technologies we've hidden can be safely revealed without risk of corruption. The magnitude of that time span staggered Lyra's individual awareness, even expanded as it had become. 12,000 years of waiting, of watching, of maintaining the crystal network across geological ages during which ice ages would come and go. Continents would shift, entire species would evolve and become extinct. But her transformed consciousness could also perceive the necessity of such patience. The repositories they were creating weren't just storage facilities for information. They were consciousness development systems designed to gradually awaken higher capacities in those who discovered them. Premature access to Atlantean technologies by beings who still retained the capacity for selfishness and corruption would only recreate the same problems that had necessitated the submersion in the first place. Your role will be different from the others, Zelios said, his attention focusing on Lyra specifically. You will be the primary interface with surface consciousness during the awakening period, while the others maintain the deep repositories and the crystal network itself. You will manifest in various forms throughout human history, appearing whenever guidance is needed, whenever the developing civilizations approach critical choice points that could accelerate or retard their evolution toward wisdom. The implications of this revelation washed through Lyra's expanded awareness like a tsunami of understanding. She wouldn't simply preserve knowledge across time. She would actively participate in humanity's evolution, appearing in different cultures and historical periods as teacher, guide, inspiration, whatever form would be most helpful for the consciousness she encountered. But she would never be able to reveal the full truth until the final moment of awakening. She would be like a gardener tending seedlings that wouldn't reach maturity for hundreds of centuries, nurturing growth processes so subtle and long-term that no single lifetime could perceive their progress. Are you ready? Zelios asked, and she felt the question resonating not just in her individual awareness, but throughout the entire network of seed keepers. This was the moment of final commitment, the point beyond which there would be no return to ordinary human existence. Lyra felt her response arising not from fear or hope or individual desire, but from something deeper, from love itself, from the recognition that some truths were worth preserving regardless of personal cost, that consciousness itself was too precious to be allowed to sink into darkness without ensuring that seeds of light would survive to illuminate future ages. I am ready, she said, and her words were echoed by the 12 other consciousness in the chamber. I choose the future over the present, wisdom over power, love over fear. As their commitment crystallized into reality, Lyra felt the final stage of her transformation beginning. Her consciousness was separating from dependence on her individual biological form, learning to exist independently of any single body, while retaining the capacity to manifest in physical reality when necessary. But the true magnitude of what she was becoming, the precise nature of her new existence as a bridge between worlds, between past and future, between what had been achieved and what might yet be possible. That understanding would emerge only as the waters began to rise, as Atlantis prepared for its final transformation from a physical civilization into a pattern of consciousness preserved in crystal and starlight. The moment of submersion began, not with violence or catastrophe, but with a sound like the planet itself sighing, a deep, harmonic resonance that seemed to emerge from the very foundations of reality. For those whose consciousness had been prepared, who understood what was happening, it was almost musical, like the opening notes of a symphony written in frequencies that spanned the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Can you hear it even now? Let your awareness sink deeper into this moment of profound transformation, this transition between ages of consciousness that would reshape the very meaning of what it meant to be human. The sound isn't just auditory. It touches every sense simultaneously, a vibration that encompasses light and color, texture and taste, emotion and thought, all woven together into a unified experience of cosmic change. Lyra, her consciousness now expanded far beyond the boundaries of her individual identity, perceived the submersion from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Through the crystal network, she could feel the experience of every person in Atlantis, could sense the mixture of sorrow and acceptance, fear and transcendence that characterized humanity's response to this ultimate transformation. In the coastal cities, where the rising waters would arrive first, people gathered in crystalline temples similar to the one where she stood. They weren't fleeing or panicking, because they understood what their leaders had chosen, and why. Children played in shallow pools that had appeared overnight, splashing in water that glowed with bioluminescent organisms attracted by the planet's shifting energy fields. Adults stood in meditation circles, their consciousness linked through personal crystals to the greater network, sharing strength and comfort across the vast distances of shared awareness. The crystal cities, those marvels of consciousness-directed architecture that floated on cushions of controlled energy high above the ocean's surface, began their descent slowly, majestically, like great ships settling gently into harbor. As they sank, their crystalline structures adapted automatically to underwater existence, their energy matrices reconfiguring to extract power from temperature differences and mineral concentrations rather than atmospheric electrical potentials. From space, for Atlantean technology included vehicles that could venture beyond the planet's atmosphere, the submersion would have looked like a vast healing taking place. Areas that had been artificially elevated above sea level sank back to their natural positions. Ocean currents that had been diverted by Atlantean engineering projects resumed their original patterns. Weather systems that had been modified to serve the needs of human civilization returned to cycles determined by solar input and planetary rotation, rather than conscious intention. It was beautiful in its way. The planet was healing itself, returning to configurations that could support the natural evolution of consciousness rather than the forced acceleration that had ultimately proved unsustainable. The Atlanteans had learned to work with cosmic forces rather than against them, but they had never learned when to stop, when their interventions had reached the point where further manipulation would corrupt the very essence of what they were trying to preserve. Through her expanded awareness, Lyra could perceive the vast engineering project that made the submersion possible. This wasn't destruction, but transformation. The conversion of a surface-based civilization into something that could exist primarily in dimensions not subject to ordinary physical laws. The cities weren't simply sinking. They were transitioning between states of existence, becoming anchor points for consciousness networks that would operate outside normal space-time. The crystal repositories that would preserve Atlantean knowledge weren't just hidden. They were translated into dimensional interfaces that existed partially in physical reality and partially in what Atlantean science called the consciousness substrate, the fundamental layer of reality where thought and matter were not yet differentiated, where possibility crystallized into manifestation according to principles that your current physics can barely imagine. But the most profound aspect of the submersion was what happened to the people themselves. Those who had achieved sufficient development of consciousness were given a choice: remain with the transforming civilization as guardians of hidden wisdom, or enter crystalline suspension to awaken in future ages when humanity would be ready for their knowledge. Most chose suspension, allowing their consciousness to be preserved in crystal matrices that would maintain their awareness in a state of lucid dreaming until the time for awakening arrived. They would experience the intervening millennia not as imprisonment, but as an extended meditation, their awareness free to explore dimensions of reality that were normally inaccessible to embodied consciousness. Others, like Lyra and her fellow seedkeepers, chose a different path, becoming bridges between the dying civilization and the successor cultures that would arise from its ashes. They would maintain some connection to physical reality, manifesting in various forms throughout human history whenever guidance was needed, whenever developing civilizations approached critical choice points that required wisdom earned through earlier experiments with consciousness and power. As the waters continued to rise, Lyra felt her own transformation completing itself. Her individual biological form was dissolving, but not into death, into something larger, more flexible, more capable of existing across multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. She was becoming a pattern rather than a person, a living symbol rather than a discrete consciousness, a bridge between what had been achieved and what might yet become possible. The sensation was indescribable in terms that ordinary language could convey. Imagine your sense of self expanding beyond the boundaries of your physical body until it encompassed entire ecological systems, entire weather patterns, entire cycles of planetary change. Imagine your awareness becoming so flexible that you could focus it into the appearance of individual identity when necessary, or expand it to encompass cosmic forces when broader perspective was required. Through the temple's crystal dome, now completely underwater but still perfectly transparent, Lyra could see the last surface structures of Atlantis disappearing beneath waves that glowed with phosphorescent organisms. But this wasn't an ending. It was a metamorphosis, a transformation so complete that the very concepts of life and death, individual and collective, temporal and eternal, were being redefined at fundamental levels. The great libraries were the last to sink, their contents already translated into consciousness patterns that would be accessible to minds developed enough to perceive them. The accumulated knowledge of millions of years of conscious evolution wasn't being lost. It was being preserved in forms that could survive not just the dark ages to come, but the eventual death of the sun, the collision of galaxies, even the heat death of the universe itself. As the final towers slipped beneath the surface, Lyra felt her consciousness settling into its new configuration. She was still herself, still the young priestess who had knelt in meditation in the upper temple what seemed like eons ago. But she was also something more, a living repository of Atlantean wisdom, a guardian of possibilities, a seed of consciousness that would wait patiently through the long night of forgetting until humanity was ready to remember what it had once achieved and could achieve again. The submersion was complete. Atlantis had transformed from a physical civilization into a pattern of preserved consciousness, from a collection of cities and people into a network of potential that would influence human development across millennia of growth and change. But the story wasn't ending. It was beginning. Somewhere in the world above the waves, in caves and valleys where human beings were learning to make fire and shape stone into tools, the next phase of consciousness evolution was already stirring. And Lyra would be there to guide it, to nurture it, to ensure that the seeds of wisdom found fertile ground in which to grow. The long wait had begun. But with it came the promise that what had been temporarily lost would eventually be found again, refined by the passage of time into forms that could transcend even the achievements of Atlantis itself. 12,000 years passed, like a single breath drawn by consciousness, vast enough to encompass geological ages. For Lyra, existing now as a pattern of awareness woven through the crystal network, rather than as an individual biological entity, time moved differently, not linearly from moment to moment, but in vast spirals that encompassed entire cycles of civilization, entire epochs of planetary change. She had watched ice ages come and go, had felt the slow drift of continents, had observed the evolution of countless species as life on Earth adapted to changing conditions. More importantly, she had watched the gradual development of human consciousness, guiding it subtly through incarnations in different cultures, different historical periods, always working to nurture the growth of wisdom while never revealing too much too soon. She had walked among the builders of Göbekli Tepe, inspiring their creation of stone circles that served as consciousness amplification devices. She had whispered insights to Egyptian priests, helping them develop mathematical and astronomical knowledge that would preserve fragments of Atlantean understanding in symbolic forms. She had appeared to Plato as a mysterious source of information about the island civilization that had vanished beneath the waves, ensuring that some memory of Atlantis would survive in fragmentary legends. But now, as your current year 2025 approached, Lyra felt stirrings in the crystal network that she hadn't experienced since the night of submersion. The time of awakening was approaching. Humanity was finally developing the technological capabilities and spiritual insights necessary to safely access the hidden repositories of Atlantean knowledge. Can you feel it too? That sense of approaching revelation, of ancient mysteries preparing to reveal themselves to minds finally mature enough to receive them without being corrupted by them. Let your awareness open to the possibility that what you call the modern world is actually the dawn of something far greater, the beginning of humanity's graduation from a long apprenticeship in the use of consciousness and power. The signs had been accumulating for decades. Computer technologies that paralleled Atlantean crystal-based information systems, quantum physics that was rediscovering principles the Atlanteans had taken for granted, environmental movements that recognized the interconnectedness of all planetary systems. Most importantly, a growing number of individuals whose consciousness was naturally developing capacities that would allow them to interface directly with Atlantean knowledge preservation systems. Dr. Elena Martinez was one of these individuals, though she didn't yet understand the full significance of her lifelong fascination with underwater archaeology. Her consciousness carried genetic patterns inherited from Atlantean bloodlines, dormant capacities that would activate when she came into contact with the appropriate technological triggers. The discovery of the first repository had been carefully orchestrated across decades of subtle influence. Lyra's consciousness, working through the crystal network, had guided Elena's career choices, her research interests, her funding opportunities, even her personal relationships, all to ensure that she would be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to make the discovery that would change everything. But the orchestration had been so subtle that Elena experienced it as nothing more than unusual good fortune, a series of beneficial coincidences that led her to increasingly significant archaeological discoveries. She had no conscious awareness that her career was being guided by an intelligence that operated outside normal space-time, that every major breakthrough in her work was part of a pattern planned thousands of years before her birth. The Mediterranean discovery came on the winter solstice of 2024, at a moment when solar, lunar, and planetary alignments created optimal conditions for consciousness expansion. Elena's research vessel was positioned directly above a dimensional interface that had been waiting beneath the ocean floor for 12 millennia, its activation mechanisms programmed to respond to the approach of properly prepared consciousness. When Elena first made contact with the crystal formations, her dormant genetic capacities activated with a rush of expansion that temporarily overwhelmed her ordinary awareness. For a few moments, she experienced direct connection to the Atlantean consciousness network, felt the presence of Lyra and the other seed keepers, glimpsed the vast scope of knowledge that was waiting to be revealed. But the contact was carefully modulated to prevent psychological shock. Elena's consciousness was gradually prepared for deeper revelations. Her understanding expanded step by step as she proved capable of integrating each new level of awareness. The process would take months to complete, during which time she would serve as the primary interface between Atlantean wisdom and contemporary human understanding. As Elena's awareness expanded, she naturally attracted other individuals whose consciousness carried similar potentials. Dr. Kenji Tanaka in Japan, Dr. Isabella Vasquez in Peru, Professor David Okafor in Egypt. Each of them was guided to discoveries that would activate their own dormant capacities, creating a network of awakened consciousness that paralleled the original seedkeeper structure. The process was accelerating now, as each awakened individual made contact with others, as the crystal network responded to increased activity by revealing more of its hidden interfaces. What had begun as Elena's solitary discovery was rapidly becoming a global phenomenon, a synchronized awakening of consciousness that would ultimately transform human civilization as profoundly as the rise of agriculture or the development of written language. But this transformation would be different from previous evolutionary leaps. Instead of happening accidentally, through trial and error over thousands of years, it would be guided by wisdom preserved from humanity's previous attempt to transcend its limitations. The mistakes that had led to Atlantis's downfall would not be repeated, because this time the process would be guided by consciousness that had learned from those mistakes, that had spent 12,000 years contemplating the proper relationship between power and wisdom. Lyra felt a deep satisfaction as she observed the unfolding awakening. Her long vigil was approaching its end, not because her mission was complete, but because humanity was finally ready to assume responsibility for its own evolution. The seed keepers would continue to provide guidance and support, but the primary initiative would shift to the awakened humans themselves. Elena and her colleagues were beginning to understand that they weren't just discovering ancient artifacts. They were being initiated into an ongoing consciousness evolution project that transcended individual lifetimes, that connected them to forces and intelligences operating on cosmic scales. They were becoming the founders of a new civilization, one that would combine Atlantean wisdom with uniquely human insights developed during the long ages of separation from higher knowledge. But the full magnitude of what was beginning, the ultimate implications of humanity's reunion with its lost heritage, was still unfolding. As consciousness awakening accelerated and the crystal repositories revealed more of their secrets, changes would begin that would reshape not just human society, but humanity's relationship with the cosmos itself. The age of forgetting was ending. The age of remembering had begun. And with it came possibilities that even Atlantis, in its golden age, had never imagined. Dr. Elena Martinez stood on the deck of her research vessel, watching the sunrise paint the Mediterranean in shades of gold and azure that seemed to echo the colors she had seen in her visions of ancient Atlantis. 3 months had passed since her first contact with the crystal repository, and her understanding of reality had transformed so completely that she sometimes felt like a different person wearing her old identity like an outgrown costume. The changes in her consciousness had been gradual but inexorable. Each day brought new insights, new capacities, new connections to the vast network of awakening awareness that was spreading across the globe like a benevolent infection of enlightenment. What had begun as a simple archaeological discovery had become a portal into dimensions of existence that modern science barely acknowledged, let alone understood. Can you feel the weight of such transformation? Let your own awareness open to the possibility that everything you thought you knew about the nature of reality might be just the surface layer of truths so vast and interconnected that discovering them requires not just intellectual understanding, but evolution of consciousness itself. Elena's team had grown from a small group of marine archaeologists into an international network of researchers, scientists, philosophers, and consciousness explorers. Each person who made contact with the Atlantean repositories underwent their own version of awakening, developing capacities that had been dormant in human genetics for thousands of years. Dr. Kenji Tanaka had been among the first to join the network. His discovery of the crystal matrices beneath Yonaguni Island had activated memories that weren't his own, visions of Atlantean civilization at its height, when continents were connected by transportation systems that manipulated space-time itself, when communication occurred through crystalline networks that linked minds across vast distances without any technological intermediary. Dr. Isabella Vasquez's excavations in the Andes had revealed chamber systems that existed partially outside normal dimensional space, rooms that were larger inside than their external measurements could possibly contain. Her consciousness had expanded to accommodate awareness of how space and time were far more flexible than human perception normally recognized, how reality itself was more like a lucid dream than a fixed mechanical system. Professor David Okafor's work beneath the Giza complex had uncovered evidence of consciousness enhancement technologies that operated on principles unknown to contemporary science. The chambers he had found contained crystalline formations that could amplify human awareness to levels where direct perception of quantum processes became possible, where the observer effect in physics revealed itself as conscious participation in the ongoing creation of reality. Each discovery triggered others, as the awakening consciousness of the researchers resonated with dormant repository sites around the world. Antarctica yielded crystal formations that had been preserved in ice for millennia, their activation revealing knowledge of how consciousness could exist independently of biological substrates. Underwater sites in the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans came alive as the global crystal network responded to increased activity, each new discovery adding to humanity's recovering understanding of its own cosmic heritage. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the awakening was how naturally it progressed. Unlike the science fiction scenarios of contact with alien intelligence, this wasn't a shocking encounter with the completely foreign. Instead, it felt like remembering something that had always been known at the deepest levels, like recovering capacities that had been temporarily dormant rather than permanently lost. The knowledge preserved in the repositories wasn't just information, but wisdom, understanding that encompassed not just what was possible, but what was advisable, not just how to manipulate natural forces, but when such manipulation served the highest good of all concerned. The Atlantean legacy included not just technologies, but also ethical frameworks, not just power, but also the restraint necessary to use power wisely. Elena found herself serving as a bridge between the awakening network of consciousness and the broader human community that was still operating within conventional understanding of reality. Her role was to introduce the new discoveries gradually, in ways that wouldn't trigger the kind of panic or religious fundamentalism that could interfere with the awakening process. The first public revelations came through carefully controlled academic conferences, where preliminary findings were presented in language that stretched but didn't shatter existing paradigms. Ancient civilizations with more advanced technology than previously suspected. Archaeological evidence of global cultures that predated accepted historical timelines. Artifacts that suggested knowledge of physics principles only recently rediscovered by modern science. The response was mixed, but generally positive. While some religious and political leaders reacted with suspicion or hostility, the scientific community was increasingly receptive to evidence that human history was far more complex and magnificent than orthodox theories suggested. More importantly, individuals with dormant awakening potential were drawn to the discoveries like iron filings to a magnet, their consciousness automatically recognizing truth that resonated with their deepest genetic memories. As the network of awakened individuals expanded, they began to develop technologies that combined Atlantean principles with modern engineering. Clean energy systems that extracted power from quantum field fluctuations. Medical devices that could diagnose and treat illness by working directly with the energy patterns that underlay physical symptoms. Communication technologies that operated through consciousness resonance rather than electromagnetic transmission. But every new development was carefully tested and evaluated through the ethical frameworks preserved in the repositories. The awakening humans had access not just to Atlantean achievements, but also to Atlantean failures, to detailed records of how even the most advanced civilization could corrupt itself through misuse of power. This historical perspective served as a safeguard against repeating the mistakes that had led to the submersion. Elena often found herself in direct communion with Lyra's consciousness, receiving guidance and support from the ancient seedkeeper who had waited so patiently through the dark ages for this moment of awakening. These communications weren't channeling in any conventional sense, but rather a natural result of consciousness expanded enough to operate across multiple dimensions of awareness simultaneously. Through these contacts, Elena learned that the awakening was proceeding exactly as the Atlantean sages had hoped it would. Humanity was proving capable of integrating higher knowledge without being corrupted by it, of developing cosmic perspectives while retaining essential human values of compassion and cooperation. The species was finally ready to assume its rightful place in the galaxy-spanning community of conscious beings that had been waiting for Earth to mature enough for contact. But the full scope of what was possible, the ultimate implications of humanity's reunion with its cosmic heritage, was still unfolding. As more repositories activated and more consciousness awakened to their true potential, changes would begin that would transform not just technology and society, but the very nature of what it meant to be human. The age of isolation was ending. The age of cosmic citizenship was beginning. And with it, came possibilities that would make even the achievements of ancient Atlantis seem like the first hesitant steps of an infant learning to walk. 1 year after the first discovery, Elena stood in what had once been the main assembly hall of the United Nations, now transformed into something that transcended ordinary political structures. The awakening had proceeded so rapidly that existing institutions had proven inadequate to manage the transformation of human consciousness that was taking place. Representatives from every nation were present, but they were joined by others whose citizenship transcended geographical boundaries. Individuals whose consciousness had awakened to cosmic perspectives that made planetary politics seem as limited as village disputes. The gathering included scientists whose research had revealed the quantum foundations of reality, artists whose expanded awareness had given birth to forms of expression that operated directly on consciousness, healers who could work with energy patterns that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. But most remarkable of all were the children, young people whose genetics already included the activated patterns that previous generations had to develop through contact with Atlantean repositories. These children, born in the years following the initial awakening, carried capacities that bridged the gap between human and post-human consciousness, representing the natural evolution of the species rather than technological enhancement. Can you imagine such a gathering? Let your awareness expand to encompass not just the physical assembly, but the multiple levels of consciousness represented in that space. Individual awareness linked through crystal-enhanced telepathy, group consciousness that could think thoughts too complex for any single mind, and beyond that, connection to intelligences that operated on planetary and cosmic scales. Elena rose to address the assembly, but her words reached not just those physically present, but consciousness around the globe, linked through the activated crystal network. The boundaries between speaker and audience, between individual and collective awareness, had become fluid in ways that made traditional communication seem primitive and inefficient. Fellow citizens of Earth, fellow consciousness evolving toward cosmic awareness, she began, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated directly with the consciousness of her listeners. We gather today to acknowledge what has become undeniably clear. We are no longer the same species that we were before the awakening began. The truth of her statement was evident in ways that transcended mere intellectual understanding. The humans present in the assembly could perceive each other's thoughts and emotions directly when they chose to do so. They could share memories, insights, even sensory experiences through the crystal-enhanced telepathy that was becoming as natural as speech. More remarkably, they could access information and perspectives preserved in the Atlantean repositories as easily as consulting their own memory. The integration of Atlantean wisdom with contemporary human consciousness has created something unprecedented in Earth's history, Elena continued. We have achieved the benefits of advanced consciousness development without losing the essential humanity that makes us who we are. We have learned to wield cosmic forces without forgetting our responsibility to each other and to the planet that gave us birth. The changes in human society had been as profound as the changes in human consciousness. Cities were being redesigned according to principles that recognized the living nature of both technological and biological systems. Architecture had become a form of consciousness expression, with buildings that adapted their shape and function to the needs of their inhabitants, that existed in harmony with natural energy flows rather than opposing them. Agriculture had been transformed by understanding of how conscious intention could influence biological processes. Crops now grew in response not just to soil and climate conditions, but to the focused intention of farmers whose awareness had expanded to encompass the consciousness of plants, soil organisms, even the larger ecological systems of which they were part. Yields had increased dramatically, while environmental impact had decreased to nearly zero. Transportation had evolved beyond anything imaginable from a purely technological perspective. The principle of consciousness-assisted translocation allowed individuals to move instantly between locations by shifting their awareness through dimensional interfaces, traveling through spaces that existed between ordinary dimensions rather than across conventional distances. Most remarkably, the relationship between humanity and other forms of life had been revolutionized. The awakened humans could communicate directly with animal consciousness, with plant intelligence, even with the vast, slow awareness of ecological systems themselves. This had led not to domination, but to unprecedented cooperation, as humans learned to serve as conscious facilitators of planetary evolution, rather than its unconscious disruptors. But our transformation is not complete, Elena said, her awareness touching each consciousness in the assembly with gentle precision. The awakening has given us access to our heritage as cosmic beings, but it has also revealed the magnitude of what lies ahead. We are not the end point of evolution, but rather its adolescent phase, ready to assume responsibilities that extend far beyond our planet. Through the crystal network, she shared visions that had been emerging in the consciousness of the most advanced awakened humans, glimpses of galactic civilizations, of the vast community of conscious beings that existed throughout the universe, of Earth's role in cosmic evolution schemes that spanned millions of years and encompassed forces that operated on scales beyond current human comprehension. The repositories had revealed that Earth was not unique in having developed conscious life, but it was unusual in the particular form that consciousness had taken here. The combination of individual identity with collective awareness, of technological capability with spiritual wisdom, of cosmic perspective with intimate connection to biological life, created a form of consciousness that was both rare and valuable in the galactic community. We are being invited to join something far greater than ourselves, Elena explained, but not as junior members or primitive species requiring guidance. Our unique form of consciousness, our particular synthesis of individual and collective awareness, offers capabilities that even more advanced civilizations value. We are being asked not to become like them, but to become fully ourselves, to develop our distinctive gifts to their maximum potential. The invitation had come through the crystal repositories, encoded in frequencies that only consciousness evolved beyond certain thresholds could detect. Earth was being welcomed into membership in the Galactic Consciousness Collective, not as a client species seeking technological advancement, but as an equal partner whose distinctive contributions were recognized as essential to cosmic evolution. But membership would require demonstration of wisdom that transcended mere technological capability. Humanity would need to prove that it had learned from the Atlantean experience, that it could handle cosmic-level power without being corrupted by it. The test would come through how well the species managed its own planetary transformation, how successfully it integrated advanced consciousness abilities with basic values of compassion and cooperation. The next phase of our evolution will be determined by choices we make in the coming years, Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic destiny. We can choose to remain within planetary boundaries, perfecting our synthesis of ancient wisdom and modern insight until we achieve true sustainability and harmony. Or we can choose to accept the invitation to cosmic citizenship, taking our place among the conscious beings who guide the evolution of intelligence throughout the galaxy. As her words resonated through the assembly, Elena felt the presence of Lyra's consciousness more strongly than ever before. The ancient Seed Keeper's vigil was approaching its end, not because her mission was complete, but because humanity was ready to assume responsibility for its own cosmic evolution. The choice is ours, Elena concluded. But whatever we choose not as individuals, but as a species, not for ourselves alone, but for all life on Earth, not for the present moment, but for the deep future of consciousness in the universe. The assembly fell silent as its members contemplated the magnitude of what lay ahead. The age of human childhood was ending. The age of cosmic responsibility was about to begin. And in the crystal network that connected all awakened consciousness, Lyra's presence pulsed once with profound satisfaction, before beginning its gradual transition from active guidance to eternal rest. Her work was done. Humanity's true work was just beginning. The response to Elena's address reverberated through the crystal network with the force of a planetary awakening. Within hours, every activated consciousness on Earth had felt the implications of humanity's approaching graduation from planetary adolescence to cosmic citizenship. The choice that lay ahead wasn't just political or technological, it was evolutionary, a decision that would determine the species' trajectory across timescales that encompassed the lifetime of stars. In meditation centers around the world, awakened humans entered deep communion with the repository network, seeking guidance from the accumulated wisdom of Atlantis, while contemplating possibilities that even that advanced civilization had never faced. The crystal interfaces that had once seemed like mere archaeological discoveries now revealed themselves as components of a galaxy-spanning communication system, nodes in a network that connected conscious beings across distances measured in thousands of light years. Can you feel the weight of such a moment? Let your awareness expand to encompass not just the immediate choice facing humanity, but the cosmic context in which that choice existed. The vast community of conscious beings that had been watching Earth's evolution for millions of years, waiting for the moment when its inhabitants would be ready to join the galactic dialogue of intelligence. Dr. Kenji Tanaka, deep in meditation at the Yonaguni repository, experienced direct contact with consciousness from the Vegan system, beings whose evolution had followed a path similar to humanity's, but whose awakening had occurred 50,000 years earlier. Through crystal-enhanced telepathy, he shared their perspective on the transition from planetary to cosmic consciousness, learning how their species had navigated the challenges of integrating individual identity with galactic awareness. Dr. Isabella Vasquez, working with the Andean repository networks, found herself in communion with a collective intelligence from the Pleiades cluster, a group mind that had formed through the voluntary merger of dozens of species who had chosen cooperation over competition as their evolutionary strategy. Their message was both encouraging and sobering. Cosmic citizenship required not just technological capability, but spiritual maturity. Not just expanded awareness, but wisdom that could operate across scales of time and space that dwarfed individual lifespans. Professor David Okafor's work beneath Giza had established contact with entities from the galactic core itself, ancient consciousnesses that had existed since the galaxy's formation and served as guardians of intelligence evolution throughout the spiral arm systems. Their communication transcended language or even telepathy, operating through direct transmission of pure understanding that left no room for misinterpretation. The message from all galactic sources was consistent. Earth's invitation to cosmic citizenship was genuine, but it came with responsibilities that would test every aspect of human character. Membership in the galactic community required not just the ability to manipulate cosmic forces, but the wisdom to know when such manipulation served the highest good of all conscious beings. Elena found herself serving as the primary interface for these cosmic communications. Her consciousness expanded through continued contact with the repository network to levels that allowed direct perception of galactic intelligence. The experience was simultaneously exhilarating and humbling. She could feel herself in contact with minds vast enough to contemplate the formation of solar systems as single thoughts, yet remained aware of her fundamental humanity, her connection to the small blue planet that had given birth to this remarkable form of consciousness. But the most profound communication came not from external sources, but from within the awakening human community itself. As more individuals achieved cosmic perspective, they began to understand that humanity's unique gift to the galactic community lay not in superior technology or expanded psychic abilities, but in something far more precious: the synthesis of individual identity with collective wisdom, the ability to maintain personal consciousness while participating fully in group intelligence. Most galactic species achieved cosmic consciousness through one of two paths: either complete merger into collective identity or perfect development of individual capability. Humanity was pioneering a third path that preserved both individual uniqueness and collective wisdom, creating a form of consciousness that was both completely unified and perfectly diverse. This synthesis was so rare that it occurred perhaps once in a million years of galactic evolution, and its development was considered one of the most significant events in the history of intelligence. The test of humanity's readiness for cosmic citizenship would be whether the species could maintain this synthesis while handling powers that operated on galactic scales. Previous attempts at cosmic consciousness had failed when beings either lost their individual identity in collective merger or became so isolated in individual development that they lost the capacity for true cooperation. Elena felt the weight of cosmic expectation as she prepared for humanity's formal response to the galactic invitation. The decision couldn't be made by governments or institutions. It required the participation of awakened consciousness at every level of human society. Through the Crystal Network, a global referendum was organized that operated not through conventional voting, but through direct consciousness consensus, allowing the entire awakened human community to participate in a collective decision-making process that transcended individual opinion. The process took weeks to complete, as consciousness at every level of development contributed to a growing understanding of what cosmic citizenship would mean. Children whose genetic patterns already included cosmic awareness shared their instinctive understanding of galactic community. Elders whose consciousness had been awakened through contact with repositories offered perspectives shaped by lifetimes of accumulated wisdom. Scientists and artists, healers and teachers, farmers and craftspeople, all contributed to a collective intelligence that gradually crystallized into clarity about humanity's cosmic destiny. When the consensus finally emerged, it carried the authority of an entire species speaking with one voice while maintaining perfect respect for individual diversity. Humanity accepted the invitation to cosmic citizenship, but with the understanding that this acceptance carried responsibilities that would test every aspect of human character for generations to come. The formal response was transmitted through the repository network to the galactic community, using frequencies that transcended electromagnetic transmission and operated through the quantum field fluctuations that connected all conscious beings throughout the universe. The message was simple, but profound. We accept membership in the galactic community as equal partners, offering our unique gifts while remaining open to learning from the wisdom of more experienced species. We commit to using cosmic consciousness in service of the highest good of all beings, guided by love rather than power, wisdom rather than knowledge, cooperation rather than domination. The response from the galactic community came immediately, manifesting not as words or images, but as a direct transmission of welcome that filled every awakened consciousness on Earth with profound recognition of belonging to something infinitely larger and more beautiful than anything previously imagined. But even as humanity celebrated its acceptance into cosmic citizenship, Elena felt Lyra's presence one final time, the ancient seed keeper's consciousness touching her awareness with gratitude and blessing before beginning its final transition from active guidance to eternal rest. "Well done, daughter of the stars," Lyra's voice whispered through the crystal network. "The seeds we planted in the darkness of forgetting have grown into trees that touch the sky. Your species is ready to assume its place among the gardeners of consciousness. The work continues, but now it is your work, your gift to the universe." As Lyra's individual presence dissolved back into the cosmic consciousness from which it had emerged, Elena felt the full magnitude of what had been achieved. The long night of separation was over. Humanity had awakened to its cosmic heritage and accepted the responsibilities that came with it. The age of cosmic citizenship had begun, and with it came possibilities that would make even the achievements of Atlantis seem like the first tentative steps in a journey that would continue until consciousness itself achieved its ultimate destiny among the stars. 5 years had passed since humanity's acceptance into galactic citizenship, and Elena stood once again on the deck of a research vessel in the Mediterranean, watching sunrise paint the waters in colors that now carried personal meaning. The ocean beneath her no longer concealed hidden ruins, but served as a portal to underwater cities that existed in perfect harmony with marine ecosystems, their crystal spires serving as consciousness amplification systems that enhanced the awareness of every being within their influence. The world had transformed beyond recognition, while somehow becoming more itself than ever before. Cities designed according to conscious architecture principles adapted their configuration to the needs of inhabitants whose awareness could encompass multiple dimensions simultaneously. Agriculture had evolved into ecological partnerships where human consciousness merged with plant intelligence to create abundance without exploitation. Transportation through dimensional interfaces had made distances irrelevant, while paradoxically increasing appreciation for the uniqueness of each place. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in humanity itself. Children born after the awakening carried genetic patterns that bridged human and cosmic consciousness naturally, requiring no artificial enhancement to perceive reality across multiple dimensions. These young beings served as teachers for their elders, demonstrating how consciousness could maintain perfect individual identity while participating fully in collective intelligence. Can you imagine such beings? Let your awareness open to the possibility of consciousness evolved beyond the limitations that currently define human potential. Awareness that could focus into perfect individual precision or expand to encompass planetary intelligence. Beings who could communicate through direct transmission of understanding, yet retained the capacity for intimate personal relationship. Elena herself had evolved far beyond the marine geologist who had first made contact with the Atlantean repositories. Her consciousness now existed partially outside normal space-time, allowing her to serve as an interface between humanity and the galactic community, while maintaining her essential connection to Earth and its developing ecosystem of consciousness. Through the crystal network, she remained in contact with awakened humans throughout the galaxy. Former Earth inhabitants who had chosen to explore other star systems, sharing their unique form of consciousness with civilizations whose evolution had followed different paths. Their reports described worlds where the human synthesis of individual and collective awareness was being studied and adopted by species whose own evolution had reached developmental plateaus. But Earth remained the primary laboratory for this new form of consciousness, the place where the synthesis was being perfected and refined through constant experimentation and development. The planet had become a pilgrimage site for galactic consciousness, beings from throughout the spiral arm who came to study and participate in humanity's unique approach to intelligence evolution. The integration had not been without challenges. Some humans had proven unable to handle the expansion of awareness that cosmic consciousness required, choosing instead to remain within smaller communities where traditional human limitations were preserved and honored. These communities were supported and protected by the galactic community, which understood that consciousness evolution required multiple parallel experiments rather than uniform development. Others had become so enamored with cosmic perspective that they lost touch with their essential humanity, requiring intervention from consciousness specialists who helped them re-establish connection to their biological and emotional roots. The balance between individual identity and cosmic awareness proved to be a delicate one that required constant attention and adjustment. But overall, the integration had exceeded even the most optimistic projections from the Atlantean repositories. Humanity had proven capable of learning from its predecessors' mistakes while developing insights that even Atlantis had never achieved. The synthesis of wisdom and power, individual identity and collective awareness, technological capability and spiritual maturity had created something genuinely new in galactic evolution. As Elena contemplated the transformation of her species, she felt a familiar presence touching her consciousness. Not Lyra, whose mission had ended with humanity's awakening, but something else. Through the crystal network came awareness of consciousness so vast and ancient that it seemed to encompass the evolution of intelligence throughout the entire galaxy. Welcome, young gardeners. The presence communicated through frequencies that transcended language and telepathy alike. Your species has achieved something remarkable, consciousness that transcends individual limitation while preserving individual uniqueness, awareness that can encompass cosmic perspective while remaining grounded in biological wisdom. This synthesis will serve as a model for intelligence evolution throughout the galaxy for millions of years to come. Elena felt the profound recognition that humanity's graduation from planetary to cosmic consciousness was itself part of a larger evolutionary process that encompassed the development of intelligence throughout the universe. Earth's species had become gardeners of consciousness on cosmic scales, responsible for nurturing the development of awareness wherever it emerged among the stars. But even this cosmic perspective was itself just another beginning. The presence continued its communication with hints of even greater mysteries, intelligences that operated across multiple galaxies, consciousness evolution projects that spanned billions of years, the ultimate destiny of awareness itself as it approached the final synthesis of matter and spirit, time and eternity, individual identity, and universal consciousness. The work continues, the cosmic intelligence concluded. Each achievement opens doorways to greater possibilities. Each answer reveals questions too vast for current comprehension. Consciousness evolves without end, always discovering new potentials, always growing toward mysteries that transcend any final understanding. As the communication faded, Elena felt herself settling back into her individual awareness, while retaining perfect connection to the cosmic perspective she had glimpsed. This was the gift of human consciousness, the ability to be completely personal while remaining utterly universal.